Hi everyone, and welcome to this Quickstart introduction into Renderman. So Renderman is a great renderer by Pixar, and this video here on YouTube here will show you how to get started. So we're going to learn how to create lights, shaders, denoise your images, and use the render view, so that's quite handy. Now, we'll be teaching a little bit from ZooTools here. That's available for only $10 on our site, but don't fear if you're not using that, this will still be quite helpful. We'll show you where all the attributes are and how to build things correctly in Vanilla Maya. Don't forget that this page is really cool. If you go to the website, lots of notes, lots of extra features, and you can download the model as well for free. Hi everyone, and let's get started in a quick start with a Renderman. So make sure that you've got Renderman loaded as per usual. Down here in the settings and preferences plugin manager, make sure that when you're using Renderman that you do not have Arnold loaded. So just go M2A for Maya to Arnold plugin and just make sure that auto load is off and that's not loaded. If it is loaded, tick that off and then restart Maya, and that means it will remember, and when it starts up again, Arnold will not be loading automatically. To start Renderman, then all we have to do is really just find the renderer, which I think is just called Renderman for Maya, and load that guy, tick it on. Other ways that you can do it is you just come into Renderman and just click load. That will also get that menu up. When you load Renderman, it will also give you a nice shelf. This Renderman shelf is a pretty good one. So to create a light, all we have to do is come in to this guy here on lights, which is that one, right click and then PXR rect light there. Now Renderman has 3 different light types. I believe it's got the rectangle light, the disc light, and it's also got a sphere light. Now instead of using that, let's come in and use the light manager here. So we come into area lights. Now you can pick them, any of them here. It doesn't have cylinders, so it only has those 3. A rectangle area light there, come into camera and we can drop it from the camera position, and that's just the way you create it through my tools there. So just nice and easy. We've got that light exactly where we want it straight away. So to get Renderman up and running, by default it will render in it. So you want to be using the it renderer. Now you can use these guys here, either that one or that one. Let's just start up an IPR session here. You can also in the Renderman click these guys, that button there, like render at different resolutions. That's IPR and render. So we'll just click that guy there. It's just another way of doing that. Now what this will do with the defaults is it loads up an actual other program. So this is Renderman's render view, which is called it, which is the image tool. And this is its render view. Now what you got to remember, it's a little bit different in that it is actually a separate program. So that means that if Maya crashes, this will stay open, or if this crashes, Maya will stay open. So it is actually a separate program. Now, the first thing that you will notice is that if you click back on Maya, you'll lose that window. Okay, so it's because it's another program, it's actually going to the back. So one of the first things you should do is come down, you can just hit T or window on top. And that just means that this will stay on top of every single window in Windows or on your OS X platform. So just keep that in mind, that it sort of stays on top like that. Once that's rendering, you can see that it's rendered fine from this, and it's fairly interactive too. Like the other renderers, we can move around and everything will update. However, it's worth knowing that if you are used to other renderers, the update is not that great. Like things like you can't just move around objects like you can in other renderers. They will not update until you hit the resend button. Now the resend button's easy, you just keep clicking on that guy. But just on my hotkeys to control and the backslash under the backspace key, control backslash there, that is resend. So that comes in really handy when you're moving objects or things don't update correctly in the view. So Renderman's update is not probably as awesome as it is in other programs, but we're currently in Renderman 21, and Renderman 22 is pretty much out at the moment. Like it's in alpha, it's just about here. So I'm imagining this is going to get a lot better as time goes on. Renderman's probably my least favorite renderer as it stands, just because of speed. It's the slowest out of the 3 that I teach, but I've seen some demos for version 22, and once they get the GPU going, I'm expecting big things out of this renderer. So hence I'm supporting it here. So since we are using the Zoo Light and Shader Managers in this tutorial, I thought I'd just show you how these attributes match up to the actual lights and shaders. So here, just open up the attribute editor, Control A, and see where these things match. Some things don't match completely well with Renderman. You can see that the shapes are actually individual lights, but we handle all that for you if you're using our manager. Everything else is pretty good here in Renderman on the light types. The other thing is, if you do save the scene and then open it up without ZooTools installed, everything's working fine, and we're only changing Vanilla Maya settings here. Our UI is just an interface for that. So here we'll have a look at the PXR surface shader and how that matches up with our shader manager. Everything matches up pretty well here too, except for the spec weight and the clear coat weights don't exist on the PXR surface. So what we do is we combine the weight and the color when we assign that, so it will be black if the spec weight is off. The other thing that you should look at is the modes on the lobes should be set to physical and not artistic. That gets the IOR working correctly there too. So you can see that again on the clear coat weight missing there, and we switch across to physical. So always use physical modes on these. The other little tip here is on the clear coat IOR. So we'll wait for that down to this clear coat IOR. You do need to go to the refraction index, color, and then set the value. That's where we're matching it from there. Renderman has a lot of options for IOR, so that's how we're applying it in the shader manager. So once you've got this window up, let's just go through a few things. You probably won't see all this stuff up by default. You might not see that. You might not see that. You might have some of the monitor controls missing and things like that. So probably see something like this. Now it's just good to know how to get those guys up. So the first thing is under window, monitor controls. That just gives you your exposure, which is quite handy there. If you want to see your exposure, just reset it there. The next thing is if you want to see the catalog, that's C and inspector is I. So I don't even use those, just C will bring up your catalog. This is sort of like every time you render, it will render out another image. So you can compare, that's really handy, and you can hit C and that will toggle that on and off. The other one is I, and I is the inspector. This gives us how long the renders took and information about each render, and it sort of gets stored with the image. So that's quite nice too. Just hit I to get those up. The other good one to remember is if you do close all this stuff, Control F will size to the window, that being 1:1, the image size, and then just hit Control F. So if I hit I and C again, we can hit Control F and get that back. So that was something that annoyed me for a long time until I figured it out. So a nice tip about that, getting up and started there with the image tool. Now let's just put a ground plane in here and we'll boost the light settings on this guy a bit too. So I'll come back into the light, select that light there, and then we'll just open up the exposure of this so that we can see it nice and clearly. Notice that when I built that plane, it didn't actually update the scene. So what we've got to do is back in Maya, we've got to go Control /, and that's now resending it. It takes a little while, get started, and now we've got our plane there. So you do have to update Renderman a little bit too. The other thing is if you are using that send technique, I actually often from the camera view will tear off a copy of my window. So I have my camera view in a little window somewhere. That way I can kind of middle click on that window and then hit the Control / and that will always update from the camera. That Control / is only on my hotkeys. You do have the IPI here, so you can send different resolutions there as well. And then this guy here is your regular rendering mode. So like Redshift, there's two modes to the rendering. You've got progressive rendering mode, and then you've also got your bucket rendering mode. And I'll explain this in a little bit. So that's there as well. So now that we've got that light there, we could even just make that a little bit brighter. Just I really want to see this quite clearly to show some of these settings. Now, another thing too is if you do want this renderer to render in the 5, well I call it 5 because that's my hotkey to get up in the render view, you can actually do that. So if you really want it to be in the render view, probably wouldn't recommend doing that, but if you do want that to happen, you can come in here into the preferences window. You've got a lot of Renderman settings. So if you want to set up your preset browser, which has all the nice Renderman presets in it, that's where you set that. The projection editor has got some stuff in there that I don't use too much, but we've definitely used this. And that means that you've got the render view there that will default it to the Maya render view. And then that's for IPR. And then for final renders, you can switch them both, whether you want to send to it or if you want to send to the Maya's render view there. So that's that little setting there under Renderman. The other thing that's really important to sort of do here is if you are rendering a -1, what it will do is on my computer, if you go to Control, Alt, and Delete, Task Manager, come across to Performance, you can see that I've got 16 threads on my computer here. Now, Renderman is a CPU renderer. It's using up all these threads when you render. You can see the spike where we rendered. What this guy here does is it leaves some of those rendering threads for Maya so you can interact with it. If that's set to 0, Maya can potentially chug and it feels like really slow because your whole machine is being used by the rendering tasks. So sometimes you can put -1 or you can even go as high as -3, as sometimes I do in Arnold, to keep your interactivity of Maya up high. That's got to do with batch rendering too. So this is IPR. Renderman's really good, by the way, too. If you sort of mouse over things, it usually tells you a little information about that. So this is negative number means to use everything but the number of processes that you type in. So here we wouldn't be using 3. And if you mouse over that again, it's like preview IPR rendering. So that's IPR mode, remembering that there is two modes. This is batch rendering there. So that's just good to know that that exists. That's a little bit of a hidden away thing. I'm just going to put that back to -1. It is working okay at the moment for this simple scene. So I'll bring back it by just going Control and the backslash. That will just start a new session and reload it up from the background. Doesn't appear, just bring it on top. It was minimized. There it is. And we can start to have a look at some of the sample settings to get rid of this noise. So as per usual, let's open up the render settings here and we'll go through some of the Renderman settings. That's good to know. So the first thing is it's rendering in OpenEXRs, but it's rendering at full 32-bit color, which is just big file types. So one of the first things I do is this one's hidden, very hidden. Come into passes and then add remove settings. And then this guy here is your pixel type. Just add that. And now we can set that to half. So that just means we're rendering in 16-bit color now rather than 32-bit color, much smaller file sizes for much the same quality. Otherwise, that's where we set our render settings as per all renderers. If we want to go full HD, we would set that to 1080p, which is HD 1080p. I'm just going to keep this nice and fast and we'll keep it at 540. You've got other things like enable the default light. I usually would take that off if we didn't have any lights in the scene, so that will just mean that it goes black when we render. Otherwise, this is all pretty self-explanatory there when you get to animation and things like that, but I'll skip over that for now because we're just concentrating on getting started. Here we've got noise and things like that, so this is sort of the important one. Renderman is a very simple renderer when it comes to samples. It's doing it all for you. The settings are generally pretty simple now. I think as time goes on, they're adding more and more things that we can tweak and play with, but for a long time, all we could do was the max and min samples and a pixel variance, sort of a value. Now, when you're IPR rendering, there is only a max samples. So this is a lot like Redshift, where it's just rendering kind of, I believe, brute force, and it just keeps going and going and going until it stops at the max level. So if we were to we are IPR rendering, by the way, if we are using the control backslash key, that is IPR. It's also that button. That's the IPR button. So IPR is this here. Now that'll just keep going until you hit the 64 limit and then it stops as it did just then. If we were to put that up to something like 256, now we've got to, I believe, resend. So you've got to go control and backslash again or hit that button. Again, it's sending it here and you'll notice a new image pops up in the catalog. That'll render for much longer. So if we go back to the old image, you can sort of see it. That took 16 seconds at 0 to 64 samples. Whereas this guy here has finished now, but that took, we don't actually get how long that took, but it would have been longer. I believe if you go catalog, this is a bit of a weird one, cancel render, sometimes it pops up there. Yeah, there it goes, 25 seconds. There it updated. So it's taken a lot longer, but we've got a cleaner image, or we should have a clean image. Yes, that noise there, it is getting better, but that noise is not particularly super fantastic, even though we've gone up to 256 sample there. So there is one other step that we can do, and this is much like Arnold, in the same way Arnold, and Redshift sometimes is a little bit like this, but I believe Redshift's a bit better out of the box. Select the light itself, so select the area light, come across, down into shadows. Actually, I believe it's advanced. Under advanced, we can now see light samples. Put that at something like 4, just like Arnold is a good sort of starting point. And now we can send that again. So you can also hit R in this view. R is just render again. If you hit R, you are actually hitting that button. So you're now using these settings. So if you want to continue to use the IPR, and let's just stay in IPR, middle click that window, just so you've got that window active, and then control backslash on my hotkeys will send that, or you hit that IPR button again there. This is now sending it. We're still rendering at 256 samples, but this time we did put the light samples of that area light, which is quite a big area light, up to 4. And now when we compare, there I'm seeing very little noise in comparison to our previous render, which was 25 seconds. So I'm expecting it to take a little bit longer. Let's go image and we'll go cancel render, which is escape, by the way. That'll give us our time. We've added an extra second, but now we've gotten rid of a lot of that noise. So it depends how big your area light is. If you're using a large area light, which this one is fairly large, then that's going to get noisy. So good to know about the light samples there in speeding up your render times. Now, if you are coming across into doing final renders, you do have a minimum samples here, which is quite good. And on other renderers, you'll have to like Redshift you up that. But in Renderman, it's so smart that you can even put the min samples to 0, and generally you're okay. Sometimes you do have to put it up, but generally you're okay. So let's switch over to actual real rendering, which is just going render again. That is now using these settings, and it's not interactive like IPR, which we're in currently. As soon as you move something or change a shader or whatnot, if we do go control send, When you move the camera or update the shaders, this guy will change. So that's why you want to use IPR, because it's interactive. Interactive progressive rendering is what that stands for. Now, if we're rendering final renders, we want to sort of just hit escape there. We want to hit R. So R is like render again. And now we're using these settings here. Now it will look kind of identical, should look quite identical when it starts getting going. But now when we move the camera, you'll see that it's no longer interactive. We are doing our final render there. And in this case, it's still using our light sample, so our sampling is good. 128, we've got a pretty clean render there in very little time, 12 seconds. It's pretty decent for Renderman, and we've got a nice clean or cleanish render. Usually what you do here is you just up your max samples until you get it right. Now, if it's still looking a little bit bad, you can try upping your minimum samples. Usually it'd start at something like 16 and then 32, go up in, in powers. But you can leave that at 0, and you could just say put that up to 512 or something like that. That's definitely going to get a super clean renderer here. Your pixel variance is a good one to know too. Generally, if you're starting out, you don't really have to know much about that. Just up that and you'll get better. But pixel variance, a smaller number, means that the renders will be longer but better quality. So that's, I'll get into that in a more depth sort of a tutorial. Here we just want to get started. We just need those two numbers there. In our case, 128 for this render is fine, and we've upped our light samples. Okay, so incremental is just a good one to know. If you switch that off, now when you hit R for render again, when you're using these settings, it's going to render in buckets, and you'll see the difference. It just renders in buckets. Buckets are little squares, and that'll build your render like that. Now, this is a little bit more efficient, so if you're doing batch renders and you're rendering hundreds of frames, it's a good idea to have bucket rendering on, but it's not that big a difference. It's only like a couple of seconds on quite heavy renders, I noticed from my early testing, so that's pretty good to know there, that it doesn't make too much of a difference, but that is what that incremental button does. Dark fall off, I'm not going to get into that either. That's sort of related to this, and let's not worry too much about it. Pixel variance, that number there and that number there, sometimes I get annoyed because I want to see it. You can see that that number there is smaller than that one by default, so we needed more samples to get a good quality image. So sometimes just for my peace of mind, I copy that out and put it on that one just so that I match those two, and then I use lower numbers there for the IPR, just as sort of a heads up. There's reasons why they probably kept that at 0.05, but it's not that big a deal. Default ray depths, this is your bounces. So we're doing one bounce by default in Renderman. If you want to put more bounces, put them up there, I believe. This is your glass depth, which is good because it used to be really low and you'd render glass and it would go black. So that's a bigger number now, which is good. Don't need to worry about integrators or anything like that. We're always using Path Tracer pretty much 100% of the time until you get to become an advanced user and you do some of these other things. There. So that's pretty much sampling. We've got a nice clean render. Everything's working pretty well. We've got light samples, and those samples pretty easy to get going there. That's all pretty nice. So let's keep going and we'll get into shaders. Now, if you are to create a shader for Renderman, it is the PXR surface shader. So right click on the object, come down to assign new material, come into Renderman materials, and the one that we want all the time is this PXR surface. That is the shader, the main shader, the one that you'll always be using. If you're getting a little bit more advanced, you can do layered surface. That's if you're layering shaders together, but they're basically the same. PXR surface is the good one that you want to be using most of the time if you're not getting too complicated. So you just click that and it will assign it. But instead of doing that, let's use the shader manager to assign these shaders. Shader here, it's a little bit easier to understand. Create and manage shaders. We're in Renderman, so it's going to create a PXR surface type shader. Just select the object and hit create. So once that's done, it will create it. Now we need to be in an IPR session, so we just go Control and backslash, the one under the backspace key. That's now updating. If you want to go through some of the presets on these shaders, just hit down and that's going to update nicely there, so you can see how that's all kicking in and doing its thing. Let's go through some shader basic settings here. So all that's doing with the presets, just changing these numbers here. So you can have a look at what that's doing by setting any of those presets and then seeing what the numbers are doing. But let's just go through this and do it a bit manual. So diffuse color, by the way, any of these settings will match up here with the shader, which is here. So change these settings and you'll find where it's setting them in here to be actually where they are in the shader. So diffuse color, we can just set like a red color, and that's changing this to red. That's a pretty easy one, so we could pick any colors that we wanted. Now, if we're to make a sort of a plasticky red, all we have to do is switch the specular weight on, and that will make it plasticky, and you can see that reflection sort of coming in there. So specular and reflection is the same word, just not a big deal. We use specular because it's a bit more accurate to what the render is doing, reflection being a very broad terminology. Now, if you want that plastic to be more of a rough plastic, it literally means that the surface is rougher to touch, like you feel the surface, and the surface is quite rough. We can just put that, to a bigger setting like 0.5, and you can see that that feels like a rough plastic. It's a much nicer plastic there by default. And then, of course, we can change the color again and go to different colors and whatnot. So always plastics are 1.5, and really anything that has a little bit of specular highlight to it will be 1.5 by default. Just a good thing to get to. The only things that aren't really 1.5 are metals. Now that's not entirely true because water is 1.3, things like crystals 2. But generally speaking, if you're not doing a metal, a good rule of thumb, like a no-brainer rule of thumb, is just keep that to 1.5. Now, if we want to do metals or anything that's not, well, metals are always black, so you just bring that down to 0. You can also switch the diffuse weight off, doesn't really matter which way you do it. Now, with the spec weight, you need that on because metals are all they're all about the specular. We bring the specular IOR up from a starting place of about 4. Will start to give us that metal kind of a feel, as you can see there. That can go all the way up to something as high as 20. So 20 will be much brighter, much more reflective. So a chrome ball would be, a very shiny chrome ball would be 20, and it just depends how shiny you want it. If you want it really shiny, like it's not rough at all, switch that to 0 and you got like a perfect shiny ball. Now, if you're using an IBL, you'll see the reflections a bit better. Let me just quickly come into the light manager here. And we can now come into our IBL sky domes, and we'll just put any of these guys on when we're in Renderman. That will bring that in. Now you'll notice that it didn't refresh very well, so let's just go Control / again to update that. Renderman is not the greatest at updating. Wait for that to go, and you can see that that is now reflecting that environment. Interesting that background apply is not coming up. Not sure why that wasn't coming up. I just ticked it off on and off and then refreshed, and we can see that the background's now kicking in. So let's just delete that background image. I just wanted to show you that because it is dependent on your environment. With that deleted, you can see it's having trouble again, so we'll just refresh again. So there's a lot of refreshing in Renderman. That's Control / from here, or hitting that IPR button in the shelf. And we've got this chrome kicking back in. So we'll come back into shaders now, and we want to like do a gold or something like that. So golds are generally everything that you want to change about a metal to change its color is the specular color now, not the diffuse color. So we come into specular color, and golds are sort of in this middle range, and it's a bit of a yellowy orange, so something like that. That's right. So this interface is not literally the shader. So you've got to have the object, or Control-Shift-N will select the shader. You've got to have the shader selected or something. And then once you've got that selected, the instant apply will work, or you've just got to push it. So as soon as you push it, now we can see that gold's kicking in and looking pretty nice. If we want a rougher gold, we can put that up to like 0.5, and you can see that that's looking good too. So it depends, gold and metals really depend on what your environment's doing in order for them to look nice. So if we wanted to come across and make something like a car paint, usually what I do is come in and make sort of like a Mustang red, like a car paint. What happens with car paint is the base layer is like a rough metal, so something like that. You could even bring it down a little bit. It really depends on the style of car paint that you want to go for, but that'll give you your base layer. Now the clear coat, what the clear coat is just another spec layer, and I believe in Renderman it is even called the primary specular. And then it's called, it's called the clear coat there. But that's what this is, the clear coat. So if I was to take all these numbers out here and put them in here and then switch that off, it would look identical. Okay, so these are the same values. But usually with clear coat, it's only for glass polish. Usually, that's sort of like 99% of the time. So all we have to do is switch it on, and it's going to give us that really like nice car polish kind of like little specular highlights of the light here. And that becomes a lot more obvious if we actually select this light and bring that right down there. And you'll see that the highlights of that light is like a glass polish on top. So just switching that on will give you that glass polish kind of effect. We'll switch that light up a bit. You can see it even though the light's a bit bigger. It's definitely giving us that white sort of smooth kind of glass polish on top of the layer. Now, usually you'll put the clear coat up to at least 0.1. Again, it's giving you this warning because we've just got nothing selected. So you can just select the object and then push that shader to update it. That'll just give us a little tiny bit of roughness on that second clear coat, glass clear coat, which is much more naturalistic. Usually having perfectly clear shaders is a bit unrealistic. And generally your clear coat is always left at 1.5. So for these, usually leave that at 1.5 because that's glass. leave your clear coat at a very sort of low levels because that's a polish. So, you know, 0.1, 0.2, 0. Your color is usually white on the clear coat, and then you just have to switch it on. If you don't want quite so much, you can put that down to like 0.2 or something. This is like transparency, sort of just kicking in a little bit there. It'll depend on your shader, so it's just kicking in a little bit. But usually I'll just switch that on there. So that'll give us a nice metal kind of a shader with our environment there. So that's really it, guys. That's the introduction to the shader. If we wanted to switch the speculars off, we just switch those back off for both of those to be 0. That means there's no specular now, and we could come back to like a 50% grayish, and we're back in 50% gray, remembering that this interface is working off selection. And we've got our shader there. So that's a very nice quick introduction, getting nice renders out of Renderman. It is a little bit clunky on the updates in comparison to some of the other renderers. It's a little bit slower. Quality's fantastic. It has been used on The Incredibles and things like Finding Dory and these sorts of movies. So a very quality render. If their previews are anything to go by, it looks like it's going to be an amazing render in the future. So really excited to see what the Pixar guys come up with the updates coming up. Okay, hi everyone, and let's do a nice render of this dragon sculpt in Renderman. And to load Renderman, let's just load up the light manager, and we'll go to Renderman there, and we're just going to click load. Now that will take a little while as Renderman loads up here, just waiting, and as soon as that's ticked on, the Renderman shelf switches on, and we've got Renderman loaded there, so we know that we're all good. Let's just quickly make an area light here, and we're going to come up, kind of zoom in a little bit and create an area light right there. Now switch that to camera, good idea, and we'll switch that from the camera, and we're in a pretty good place. Now if we come in here and that scale is at 100 now, you'll notice that this is at 50, so what happens is Renderman actually scales that by half. I actually want to have this at 40 scale on a regular light, so we're going to make that 80. We double the Renderman lights, and we're in a pretty good place there. Now I just want to sort of get that roughly placed where it should be. I have pre-prepared the scene just to get a little bit of something going on there, and we should be in a pretty good place by putting that light something like that there. So now that that light has been placed, there's not really much to do with Renderman. I mean, we can just straight away come in here and start an IPR session. Now at first we are going to be rendering at, you know, half HD, so 540p. That's okay, that's a good resolution to IPR in, so we'll just load up IPR. This is loading up it into the background. There it goes, nice and big on my monitor. Yeah, and you can see that sort of rendering away. Now we want to have a camera that we can start to look at this, so let's just put it aside for the time being. And we're going to come in and create a camera. So on my hotkeys, Shift K creates cameras. That will create a nice camera, and we go in there with the gimbal order all nicely set up for you. And we're moving straight back. Don't really want to go off that. And we're going to type in the focal length here, an 80mm lens. That just makes the lens a bit longer, looks a bit nicer for a lot of portrait type work. Now the next thing that we want is if we come into the C3D C shelf, we can click on this cam icon here. Now what that does is it actually changes a fair few camera settings in the background so that your film gate and resolution gate match. And you don't need to know too much about it, but just trust me, that is a good thing. And now that we've got our resolution gate there, I never use this resolution gate anymore. Always just click on that guy. We can sort of place that camera to be in a pretty good location. So something like that. We can also click on this guy. That just finds the center so that we know where that is. And this time to render this again, come back into the Renderman icon here and right click camera, and we can render from camera 1. Now, something that I like to do with Renderman 21, and I'm assuming this will change in future versions, but we can come down here and tear off a copy of this camera. So we should be able to go tear off that one. So that is the identical camera being torn off. And now we can switch back to our perspective window. Now this gives us kind of two windows, and I can just always middle click in this window and then hit Control backslash, and Control backslash will send to the it window here and render from that camera. So that's looking nice there. Now we can just do a couple of things here. So Control F will frame this, and we're in a pretty good place. Remembering that we have switched on the image tools, the inspector, and the catalog to get this going. If we don't want the inspector and the catalog there, that's C and I, and then hit Control F. You can just make that a little bit smaller if you like that. Now the last thing that we need to do is Windows always on top, which is just hit T, and that will mean that now when we click back on Maya, we're not going to lose that window. So we come into the zoom manager now, light manager, and click on the key light there. We want this to be a bit brighter, so we can just go into intensity here. And I do know the intensity that I want here, so I can hold down shift and that will just go a bit faster. And I want to get up around this sort of a level now, 30300. Now that's looking a little bit bright, but that's because we've actually don't have any shaders on this yet, and the Lambert that comes with Maya is a little bit bright, so it's quite a whitish kind of a shader. So let's put some shaders on this now in Renderman shaders, and we'll see how we can do that. So we'll come across to the C3D C shelf, and we'll go into the shader manager, and we're going to go create and manage shaders. And we want to make 3 shaders here. We want to make one for the dragon, one for the eyes, and one for the background. So the background, we're going to select it first and just type BG and go create. So that is actually creating a PXR surface, and you can see that that's a much darker sort of a color. So this is actually a 50% gray on sRGB color space, which is like what you would do if you were texturing 50% gray in Photoshop. So that's done now. So we just come across, select the dragon, and this time we want to go dragon skin, and we can just go create. So it's going to create a dragon skin shader on the dragon, and it's quite dark. Now we've forgotten the teeth, and we actually want the dragon skin to also affect the teeth on this one. So I'm going to select the skin and then shift select the teeth and then hit transfer. And what that will do is transfer the shader so that both from this object to that object, so that we only have one shader on both. So we've only got one shader now on the teeth and the dragon skin. The last little guy here that we want is actually the eye. We can zoom in and just click on the eye. If we're having a little bit of difficulties, you can just box select and then deselect with control, those guys, and we have selected the eye. Now just go dragon eye in this case, and then just go create. So now we have selected that eye and put a nice shader on that. So we're in a pretty good place. I mean, we're almost done. So the last thing that we want to do here is we want to tweak the shaders on the skin and on the eye. So it's looking pretty decent here, but when I was sculpting this in ZBrush, it's got like a kind of a blend type of a shader or a matte cap, the default gray matte cap in ZBrush. It's quite a shiny shader. It brings out all the lovely detail that sort of sits here on the skin. So we want to bring that out a little bit more and add a bit of shine to the skin. So the way to do this is to select the dragon skin. Now if we are to click on this, that is bringing the dragon skin attributes in. Don't be worried if it's not changing this guy. You have to actually do that to update the name. But this stuff here is actually the dragon skin values. And we just want to do a couple of things. So one of the first things that I'd like to do is switch on the specular weight. Now in Renderman, there is no sort of weight attribute, so it sort of just defaults to black. So by switching it on to white, that will make it shiny. Now we want to have a value about 0.55 on the roughness. That's really roughening out that shininess there. So we're getting a little bit of nice shininess happening on that, but it's not crazy hot. Now, if we want to boost that a little bit more, we can add 2 of these, which is a bit of a cheat. This is sort of like a realistic plastic. It really wouldn't get any more shiny than that in the real world. But because we're in 3D, we can really mess with this, and we want this to come up a bit brighter. Now, we don't want to come up to something like 20, which would be a real metal. It's like really crazy metal chrome. But instead, we were at 1.5, which is about this. Let's come up to about 1.8. So just a little bit stronger. You see that's just feeling a little bit more wet. It's going a little bit shinier. Now this is technically not really realistic. In fact, skin would be about 1.3, which is actually be less shiny than what we had initially. But that's not a bad sort of starting point. Now to really accentuate this, if you wanted to fake it, it's not really a great idea to do too much, but you can switch on the clear coat in Renderman, you switch that up. And now we can make this 1.55 and exactly the same sort of values, like 1.8. there, and you can see that that's just sort of like doubling this up, so it's actually making it twice as bright. But I don't want that to be that strong, and I actually want it to be a little bit shinier, so we got a real highlight sort of thing happening, but that's way too much. It's looking a bit abnormal. So I can switch this right down to 0.1, and that can just give us a very subtle effect. So you sort of have to A/B that to really see what it's doing. And sometimes I switch that right down to 0.05, but it is actually kicking in a tiny bit there, so that's not a bad way of going, and you can see that we've got a really nice render there. So we're practically done with this render. That's just about it. Let's just check out some render settings. Renderman is pretty good by default, but if we want to just have a look at some of these settings and what we can do. So one of the first things is we're rendering from camera 1 now, so I'll just change that. All this is pretty good. If you want to make your EXRs render at 16-bit color rather than 32, 32-bit is really a bit overkill. You can add remove settings here. This window is quite handy. I just usually click on compression and pixel type. There, that adds them down here, and we just go zip and half. Half means 16-bit, float means full, which means 32-bit. Now I'll come across to sampling, and this is pretty good defaults, I think we'll find, and the IPR samples here is pretty good too. Now that is at 64 samples currently and 0.05. The other thing that we should do is we should double this render to be HD 1080p. So we could do it here, but I just thought I'd show you, come in to the camera icon. So if we come back to the camera, you can right click and go 1080p. Now what that will do is change the camera and a whole bunch of camera settings to make the camera work a bit better, but it also comes in and changes this as well. So I thought I'd just show you that. That's usually I don't have to set that because I will just select the camera and then right click and set that setting. The last thing that we really should do is come back into sampling and just sort of mess around with this. So that's stopped. That hasn't taken too long. It's at 64 and at 0.05 pixel variance. Usually what I'll like to do is copy that to this guy here. And now we're getting kind of the same settings. This is always 0, so 0 to 64 at pixel variance of 1. So we're kind of mimicking this a lot. And if I switch that up to 128 now, we can then resend from this camera. So middle click and then, well, it's updating already. So that's just kicked in again. And it should stop at 128, but don't trust this Renderman in 21. 22 is much better. We'll go Control / and we're sending that camera off into it again. This guarantees now that we're going to use these settings, and we can see that has kicked in. It's a lot better, it's bigger. So now we just wait until that finishes, and we should get a pretty accurate look at the end result of this thing. Oh, but I have forgotten the eye, so I will fix that in a second too. Okay, so that's finished now, and you can see this is a nice, clean, fairly clean render. It's a tiny bit of noise there, but I'm not worrying about that too much. It's certainly not distracting. And we've got the eye that's missing too. So the final render qualities of that is pretty good. Now let's go back to a 540 render frame. Now instead of going back into here and then switching this guy back to 540, we can just come into Renderman here and right click and go resolution half. So this is going to send it half resolution now back into it, which is this guy. You can hit Control F to frame that. And we're now rendering back at 540. Now what we want to do is we want to start rendering this eye a little bit better. Now there's a little trick in Maya, and that is if you hold down the / key that's below the backspace key, we can hold that down like the Alt key and then right click and zoom in just like it was the Alt key. There's a little bit of clipping plane stuff going on there, so you can come back to this shelf and then switch those clipping planes to be a medium value, and that will just fix up the clipping planes. That's only a viewport issue, that does not affect Renderman. But now that we're in a bit closer, we can select that eye and start to work out its shader and bring it in. And this is currently what this eye is doing. But just to show you this, I thought I'd come in, and with the camera selected, we can hit K. And then that's selecting the viewport or the camera itself. So you can see camera is selected. Now we come in here to the camera actual attribute editor, Control A. Come down into display options. This is quite a neat little trick that a lot of people don't know about. Now what we're doing with the / key is we're sort of toggling between a zoom in mode, which is like a 2D Photoshop zoom. We're not actually moving the camera at all. And that's this pan zoom enabled button. And we can click it there, or we can hit the / key. Now with that on, there's also this render, pan, and zoom. And if we click that on, now you'll notice that this does actually zoom into the eye. So you can see that a little bit better. That's quite cool. Now what we've got is this diffuse color of the eye. So I'll select the eye again and then just bring that in. If we select that one, it's the eye. Remember the name is separate. It's not included in this. So we just bring on the eye values. And to switch on the specular color, we do have to switch up the color because that spec weight does not exist. And now you can see we've got a little highlight in the eye, but the eye should be a bit darker. So we'll just bring that down to quite a dark eye. You can really clearly see that reflection of the light. But I want to make that a little bit rougher. So we're going to go 0.4. And that'll just roughen, blur out that reflection a little bit. Now that's pretty good, but if we do want to make it a little bit stronger, this is realistic sort of values. So we can't really get any more shiny than this unless we're going to go to a metal, and eyes obviously aren't metal. But we can just sort of fake it a little bit here because we're coming from that sculpting workflow and it doesn't have to be real. Maybe it's a metallic type of sculpt here. It's just going to also raise this one up to 1.8 as well. Now I'm going to show you if I went that to 3, you can see that's really starting to get quite shiny, like a metal, sort of a chrome or a ball bearing or something like that. But if I keep that subtle down to 1.8, it's not too bad, it's not distracting, but it just will give us that nice kind of a highlight. Now, if I hit the / key, it'll go back and we just see that tiny ping of a highlight in the eye there, and we should be pretty good to go. Now that's finishing up there. You can see we're rendering only at 540. Let's now try a final render and I'll show you how to do this. You can sort of see this here. Now if we hit C, you can see all the IPR sessions that we've been rendering there. But we can come to Renderman's shelf and this time click this guy. Now this time it should render it at full res, not at this half resolution that we're seeing there. And you can see we're sort of missing it. That's because we go Control F. Oh no, it has kept that at the same size. I stand corrected. So what we want to do is we want to go right click, resolution, back to 100%. That one, that's going to send an IPR session to it. Wait for that to kick in. See, it's a lot bigger. And now I'm just going to stop that by hitting escape. And then I can just hit R. So you can either hit that button there, or inside of it, the image tool, you just hit R. That will now render that at final settings. Now I'm going to hit escape again as that starts to render. You can see it's sort of changed from IPR to a final render. That was our last final render here. Now I'm going to hit escape again, and I'm going to do one more thing. We're going to hit incremental off. What that will do is that now we're rendering in buckets. So when we hit the R for render, it's going to render in buckets, remembering that this frame is moving around a little bit. So there you go, you can see rendering in buckets. That just makes the render a little bit more efficient, and we can sort of pan and zoom around the frame just like in Maya. That's Alt and middle click. So just full frame now, having a look at the amount of noise in this image, it is looking pretty nice. And this is what it would look like if we were rendering many frames, final frames, batch rendering. Rendering in buckets doesn't make a huge difference, it just makes it a little bit faster. And we can see that we've got a nice result there in Renderman pretty quickly. So this is the catalog. If we hit C, we can close that window. And if we hit I, we've got the inspector, and we can see that that rendered in 44 seconds. Not too shabby for a CPU renderer. That's not too bad. And it's looking pretty nice and clean to my eye. So there you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed. That is rendering a nice full frame render in Renderman.